So, let me tell you, in order for Hebrews to make sense, you really have to know Exodus and Leviticus and a bit of Genesis. Because the author makes a lot of references to Jewish customs that were recorded in Exodus and Leviticus, as well as some general stories of Moses and Abraham. And turn with me to Hebrews chapter 9. So, up until this point, the author's been making a comparison between the Levitical priesthood and Jesus' priesthood, specifically his being high priest of the order of Melchizedek. The author isn't completely abandoning this thought, but is sort of shifting it a bit from his priesthood to things connected to the priesthood, what it encompasses. So, he begins in verse 1. Now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section, called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. I just remembered it would probably help to have pictures, but I don't have pictures, so we're just going to have to use our imaginations here. So, the author here is, of course, speaking of the tabernacle, as described in Exodus 25 through 27. It takes a long time. And gives a pretty good, if very abridged, description of it. The tabernacle itself was about 45 feet long, 15 feet high, and 15 feet wide. The frame was made of acacia wood overlaid with gold. On top of that were 10 curtains made of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn. On top of that were 11 curtains made of goat's hair, which made a tent on top of the actual building. On top of that was a covering of ram skin and then a layer of goat skin to top it all off. At the entrance was a screen made of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, which hung from 5 pillars of acacia wood covered in gold. Inside, separating the holy place, the first section, from the most holy place, the second section, was another veil much like the one at the front, but with golden cherubim embroidered on it, which hung from 4 pillars made of acacia wood covered in gold. And everything actually inside the tabernacle was, in case you couldn't guess, made of acacia wood covered in gold. This was a physical sign of how much the Israelites had to invest in the tabernacle, because that was a lot of gold that they had to sacrifice for that. It was a physical sign of their commitment to God, which they kind of ignored, but that's not what we're getting into right now. So we'll get back to this point in a minute. He continues on in verse 6. These preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. But in the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until Reformation. Make sure. Okay. So the priests had to go into the first section, enter the holy place for various reasons, such as changing out the lamp oil and the bread on the table. But the most important reason was to make sacrifices for various reasons, such as for both intentional and unintentional sins, which were dealt with differently. However, only the high priest could go into the most holy place, and only on the Day of Atonement, as described in Leviticus 16. However, there was a process they had to go through beforehand. They had to take a ram and 2 goats from the people. The ram they offered for their own sins. After this, he would enter the holy place and put coals on the altars to shroud his view of the mercy seat, where the cherubim were on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and would then sprinkle blood in front of the mercy seat. The high priest would then cast lots for the goats. One of them would be offered as a sin offering for the people, and they would do with the blood that they did with the ram's blood. After that, they would lay their hands on the other goat and confess the sins of Israel and release the goat into the wilderness. This was the only time anyone could ever enter into the most holy place. And as we've seen, it is not an easy process, and it is not a quick process. What this reveals, the author is arguing, is that because only select few can enter under very specific circumstances after taking certain measures to make sure that they are worthy, and even actually hiding themselves from it, can enter into the presence of God. And the presence of God is sealed off from the people. However, these rituals, despite how important they were to the Israelites, simply made up for actions. They had no way to change the heart of the people. And there was no way for them to compel the people to follow God. They simply accounted for what had already happened. Now, what the author means by the present age here is a bit confusing in that it's sort of present, but it's also not. What it seems at a glance to mean all of this is still in place, but what it symbolizes, really, that the point he's making is a time of separation from God that brings about consciences that will be replaced by a time of reformation where the separation will end, which we'll get to in a bit. The author continues on in verse 11. But when Christ appeared as a high priest for the good things that have come, then, through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? This is getting annoying. So this is where Christ comes into this. The other high priests were unclean and simply used the blood of animals and ashes that they themselves offered to enter into the most holy place, the physical, earthly most holy place. Christ, on the other hand, offered himself and used his own blood to enter into the true most holy place. But he didn't enter into the physical tabernacle the Israelites built. He didn't enter into the physical temple that stood in Jerusalem. He entered into the true most holy place, the true throne room of God, to offer his sacrifice. This sort of copy, original dualism is something we see throughout this book. What the Israelites and what the Levites did was simply a copy of the true version, a foreshadowing of what was to come. This Christ's sacrifice signaled the beginning of a new age, the time of Reformation that the author talked about earlier, because the perfect high priest offered the perfect sacrifice in the perfect holy place. Not only are the sins of the people atoned for, but the people are allowed to be freed from sin and can have their hearts and their minds changed because of the sacrifice. The present age of sacrifices and rituals is coming to an end, he says, and instead a new era of true freedom from sin is being ushered in, beginning with the death and resurrection of Jesus. This means we're not free just from the guilt of sin, but we're free from sin itself. It means that we don't have to make sacrifices to atone for our sins because it's happened for us. Our sins have been taken care of. It means that we can be changed. It means that if we truly turn to God, not only will we be forgiven from sin, but we will be freed from the grip of sin. However, despite what many people would like to think, this is not a spontaneous change. It's a deliberate process we have to strive for. You don't just accept it. We have to act on it. We have to change our own ways, and we have to get rid of the sinful actions and thoughts so that we can be God's light to the world. The author continues in verse 15, "Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, 'This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you.' And in the same way he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin." I need to change pages. All right. So, Jesus, as said many, many times before in this book, is our high priest. It's the main argument. His death and resurrection ushered in a new covenant. One thing to keep in mind here is that the Greek word translated here as covenant is the same word that is later translated in the same passage as will. It's a bit confusing, but the passage actually makes more sense with that ambiguity in mind. So, with that in mind, I actually have a question. What is a will? Exactly. Technically, a will is defined pretty much as you said. It's a legal declaration of a person's wishes as to the disposition of his or her property or estate after death. The part of this that's important to the author's purpose is after death. A will takes place after someone dies. In order for it to take effect, the person has to die. This is a unique but interesting idea. God's will could not take effect until, in some way, God had died. That's not to say that God's will wasn't at work in the world before, but it's rather means that everything that the Old Testament was leading to, everything it was foreshadowing, the church, everything like that, could not be until Jesus died. What was told about in various places, like Isaiah 56, where it speaks of eunuchs and foreigners being accepted, people who were held in contempt by the Israelites, being saved, could not happen until after Jesus' death and resurrection. The new covenant was established when Jesus died, because that's how a will works. Now, you might not recall Moses putting blood on the law, and that's because he didn't as far as Exodus cares. However, that doesn't mean it didn't necessarily happen. As the author stated, in the Mosaic law, many things were purified using the blood of various animals. One of the steps of most of the offerings was to pour the blood of the animal onto the altar in front of the tent, and the sin offering included sprinkling blood inside the tent. This purifying with blood might have extended to the law itself. The point the author is making with this illustration is that under the old law, purification and forgiveness from sins came from blood. This will be important in a bit. Beginning in verse 23, it reads, "Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him." This first part here is where the author really starts showing the influence that Platonism had on Greco-Roman society. So the main idea behind Platonism is probably one we're somewhat familiar with, but don't actually realize it. The idea is that there is a material world, which is inherently evil, and there is another spiritual world, which is good. Everything in the material world is a shadow of something in the spiritual world. Take a chair, for instance. When we see a chair, we are actually seeing an imperfect shadow of the true chair in the spiritual world. Does this make sense? This actually goes along pretty well with Christianity to an extent. What the author is arguing here, using this, is that there is a perfect temple in heaven that Jesus went into to offer himself as a sacrifice for sins. Everything that was done on earth was merely an imperfect copy of the true one that exists in heaven. What made Jesus' sacrifice better is that it was a perfect sacrifice done by a perfect high priest in the perfect temple in heaven. every other sacrifice that the Levitical priests offered was imperfect. They were to cover what had been done by Israel, what had already been done, and only by the Israelites. Jesus' sacrifice, on the other hand, was a perfect sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice. He offered a sacrifice that was so perfect, it only had to be offered once. He only had to suffer once. Does anybody know the song, Does He Still Feel the Nails? Well, the answer to the song is no. He does not still feel the nails. Sorry if I ruined your favorite song for you. Somebody said that in chapel one day, and I love bringing that up. The sacrifice only had to be offered once. Jesus only had to hang on the cross once. His sacrifice was so perfect, it not only covered what had already happened up to that point, but it covered what was happening and what was going to happen. The old sacrifices, excluding the one on the Day of Atonement, simply covered one person. Jesus' sacrifice, however, was so perfect, it covered everyone. Even the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement didn't cover that many people. It simply covered Israel. But Jesus' sacrifice covered all sins for all of his people, for all time. Does he still feel the nails? No, because that would entirely negate the point of one sacrifice for all. The sacrifices that the Levites offered were all imitations of this one perfect sacrifice. They were all pointing towards the perfect sacrifice offered by the perfect high priest. That is some extreme foreshadowing. Everything the priests did was a shadow, an imitation, a foreshadowing of what Jesus has done. It's all a pale imitation of what was to happen. And then going on with verses 27, the point he's making is humans die once and then go to be judged. Jesus, likewise, died once and will appear again at judgment. The price has been paid. And in the end, the people who were truly followers of Christ will be saved. We are to wait eagerly for that day. And I don't know about you, but I sure wait for that day, because that will be a wonderful day. So, unfortunately for me, and possibly fortunately for you, as Josh said earlier, this is the last time you get to hear me ramble on about Hebrews. If we have a perfect high priest who offered the perfect sacrifice, shouldn't we want to tell people about it? All of the old laws and sacrifices were pointing to this perfect sacrifice that would usher in the new covenant. That will, that covenant was established by the death of Jesus, through which we are forgiven. Shouldn't we want to spread the news? I'm not saying we go around door to door or only ever talk about it, but we should be willing to bring it up in conversation. We shouldn't shy away from it. We should want to spread the news, not hide it. This isn't an exclusive club. It's something open to anyone who's willing to accept it. Jesus offered the perfect sacrifice, the one all the other sacrifices were pointing towards. Everything about the Levitical sacrifices were pointing towards Jesus. The Levitical priests, though, had to make sure to cleanse themselves before they could do anything for anybody else. They were the only ones allowed into the holy place, marking off God for his chosen elite. But that is no more. Jesus' sacrifice tore the veil covering the most holy place, allowing everyone to dwell in the physical presence of God. Shouldn't we want to spread this news? Well, then let's spread the news.